near the beginning of the conflict, there's a place called the Shifa. It's sometimes called the Shifa Hospital. It should be better known as the Shifa Hamas Command Headquarters. It's a place we know from video footage, CCTV. They took some of the hostages on the 7th, and they didn't take them to the Shifa Hospital to treat them. The Shifa had a rocket land in its car park some months ago. And Hamas immediately announced that it was an Israeli rocket that had hit the hospital and killed 500 people. Note, by the way, that the Israelis took months to work out the exact number of figures from the 7th of October who've been killed in Israel, because it's extremely hard. I've been to the morgues. I've seen the bodies. I've seen the charred remains. It takes a long time to work out who's dead in a burned-out house. Mm-hmm. Magically, Hamas can do it like that and can come up with a round figure. Oh, but after the world has said that the Israelis fired a rocket at a hospital and killed 500 people, after some time, sure as anything, we discover the rocket was an Islamic Jihad rocket fired from inside Gaza, which landed in the car park of the Shifa compound and may have killed some people, not 500. This is the day in, day out reality of reporting on that conflict.
Set against the stunning backdrop of Fiesole, Italy, Douglas Murray joins Peter Robinson on the Hoover Institution's Uncommon Knowledge, fearlessly dissecting some of today's most pressing global issues. With a sharp and unyielding critique, Murray exposes chilling truths surrounding the October 7th atrocities, unmasking media biases and double standards. From Hamas's barbarism to Western complacency, from the migration crisis to the Hamas supporting brats who have masked themselves as intellectuals, Murray's unflinching insights challenge our assumptions, urging a reassessment of courage, morality, and resilience in an ever-turbulent world.
Around the World with Douglas Murray. Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, filming today in Fiesole, Italy. I'm Peter Robinson. Educated at Eton and Magdalen College, Oxford, Douglas Murray is a journalist based in New York. His books include the bestsellers The Strange Death of Europe and The Madness of Crowds. Earlier this year, I should say, he spent a month in Ukraine and 6 months in Israel. Douglas, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you.
6 months in Israel, let's begin there. What surprised you most?
I suppose two things stand out. I got to Israel as soon as I could after the atrocities of the 7th of October. Spent the next 6 months there. I suppose one thing about the terrorists and one about the victims. About the terrorists, I would say that although I've covered quite a lot of conflicts and seen quite a lot of human evil, what the Hamas terrorists did on the 7th of October was a level of depravity which shocked me.
How many died? Remind me.
Oh, it was 1,200 people were murdered on the day. More than 300 taken hostage into Gaza. When I say the level of depravity, it's partly the fact that not just the atrocities they committed, I mean, the kibbutz, the villages, the communities on the Gaza border, and at the Nova party, where hundreds of young people were murdered. There's something about, I've seen all the atrocity videos, not just the 47-minute video that I saw pretty soon after, but a lot of people have shared with me other things that are unpublishable, unbroadcastable. And I've heard a lot of testimony from survivors and others. And I think that apart from the sheer physical violence and barbarism, the rapes, the shooting women in the genitals at the party, the beheadings, the cutting off people's heads with a cleaver and so on. I think aside from that, the thing that struck me is that they were proud of what they were doing. Now that is something that an awful lot of people have done an awful lot of evil things. I've very rarely seen one so proud of their evil as they're carrying it out. The terrorists of the 7th broadcast, GoPro videoed a lot of what they did. and they were high on evil. I mean, some people have heard the tape probably of the young man, the young terrorist, who calls his parents in Gaza and says, "Father, Father, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands. Get mother on the phone." I think it's hard to think of many cases in history where people actually not just carried out atrocities like that, but absolutely jubilant about them.
Douglas Murray's piercing exposition exposes a chilling truth, the utter savagery on October 7th, where 1-200 perished, reveals an unprecedented barbarism. Terrorists euphorically glorifying their malevolent acts. Consider the twisted glee of a terrorist boasting to parents, celebrating murder. It's an alarming mirror of humanity's darkest side. Where's the outrage for such grotesque morality collapse? How can we permit such deranged pride?
2 boys whose father was killed in front of them in their safe room, and one of the boys lost his ear and the other an eye, and they were staggering around the room. And the terrorist who just killed their father comes in and takes food out of their fridge. And one of the boys says to the terrorist, "That's my mother's food." And the terrorist said, "Where's your mother? I want her too." So a level of evil which is something that has to be thought about and, of course, dealt with. I suppose the second thing I'd say is the remarkable response of the Israeli public. Israel isn't like Britain or America. Its threats are awfully close. Maybe always were. But the first responders, the people caught up in it in the day, were not just victims, but a lot of them were extraordinary heroes. I'm thinking of people who dropped everything, drove south, picked up some guns, and fought for the next 48 hours. A friend of mine who left a farewell message to his wife and his 2 children on the way south, because he was sure he wouldn't survive. And he saved a lot of lives. People of all ages, and indeed all backgrounds. The Muslim doctor I've spoken to who was personally held as a human shield by Hamas, and who saved lives. I think of the Druze men I spoke with who were at the parties serving food and who managed, because they could understand the Arabic, they could overhear exactly what was happening. They're remarkable men. And the country is filled, in my view, with remarkable people. So those are the 2 things that stand out most. I've been in Gaza a fair amount and seen the response of the IDF and the attempt to get back the hostages and to capture or kill all the heads of Hamas. And I've watched the world lose sympathy with Israel, but they lost sympathy from about day one.
Murray's account brutally exposes Hamas's savagery. Witness the monstrous cruelty confronted by Israeli civilians, the 2 boys forever scarred, and a friend sacrificing everything in heroic defiance. Can we fathom the horror those people endured? Israel's resilience shines through civilians turned heroes, risking everything to save lives. A Muslim doctor held hostage. Druze men eavesdropping on terrorists. These are the unsung champions. Isn't this the epitome of human courage?
I want to come back to that. You've answered the question about the moral calculus over and over and over again, but I must ask the question because it is a mandatory question. If the Israelis lost 1,200, what is the number at which they really may not pursue the war any further? It feels in the response to Israel, let's put it this way, the international response with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, naming charges against Benny Gantz and the Prime Minister Netanyahu for atrocities. I don't know what the numbers actually are because the press, oddly enough, unreflectively, unchallengingly, seems to be giving us Hamas laundered numbers for the number. But it's thousands of people who've been killed in Gaza who are civilians rather than Hamas. All right, just state it one more time, the moral calculus.
Well, the first thing is I refute the idea that war that is started by an enemy like Hamas can only be responded to a certain level of casualties.
All right.
I refute the idea. I don't think it's something which Britain or America has been expected to abide by in our past. I don't think it's something we've been expected to abide by in our present. Not many years ago, when we helped to flatten most of Mosul in order to get Islamic State out of Mosul, the French, British, and American forces involved did not worry about the number of casualties, and nobody counted the casualties.
Right.
We do not know to this day how many people were killed in Mosul and northern Iraq and the borders of Syria to get ISIS. We simply wanted to get them because they'd carried out the Bataclan massacre and much more. Only Israel seems to be expected to act by this strange standard of what's often called proportionality. I like to think I shot down that idea at the beginning of the war when a journalist asked me about that, before Israel had even done anything. And I said, you know, if you believe in this idea of proportionality, it means that the IDF should be allowed to go into Gaza and kill precisely the number of children that Hamas killed and rape precisely the number of women that Hamas raped, and so on. Would that be acceptable? No. Would the Israelis abide by such a grotesque idea? Of course not. What then is the acceptable calculus? As you say, most of the international media have been relying on Hamas figures. There's a reason for that, by the way, which is that no Western media are in Gaza.
Douglas annihilates the bizarre expectation that Israel must halt defense efforts at a specific casualty number. The bloodthirsty hypocrites demanding proportionality from Israel are exposing their venomous bias. Where was this outrage when Western forces obliterated Mosul? Did anyone count those corpses? Why was that? The media's blind regurgitation of Hamas propaganda is nauseating. Aren't Israeli lives worth defending? This double standard reeks of anti-Semitism.
All right, we'll come to that as
They're
well.
not in there. They lie to their viewers. They fib. They cover up for their own journalistic failings. It's not even a failing. I don't blame a lot of it.
So let's come to that right now. Why is the reporting so, it runs from thin to biased to non-existent? I think back to the Iraq War, when we went into Iraq, John Burns, the great journalist, wrote from the New York Times. He was on the ground, he was writing, it was military reporting. You understood, any reader of the Times understood the objectives, understood the progress week by week by week. No such journalism exists. Yeah. Why?
Well, there's only two ways to be in Gaza. One is to be embedded with the IDF, as I've been, and the other is to have the permission of Hamas. Hamas are not very good hosts, and they're untrustworthy hosts. And so most of the Western media rely on journalists who are Gazans, all of whom are operating under Hamas restrictions at best, and most of whom are going to be Hamas supporters. And Hamas, as a result, has got out its figures. It came out with this figure of 30,000 people some months ago, and then they said that this was a number of casualties. They produced no evidence for it, and the world just repeated this figure. That figure, by the way, has been halved.
Has it?
Yeah. In the last few weeks, more official figures, better figures have come out from a range of sources, which say that the 30,000 figure was never true. But anyway, if you follow the IDF's figures on the number of Hamas terrorists that they've killed inside Gaza and the number of innocent civilians killed, if you take even the Hamas figures, you're dealing with roughly, and this is a horrible calculus, but this is war, you're dealing with roughly one terrorist killed to one civilian. America in the field in Afghanistan managed something like one terrorist to 3 or 4 civilians. Right. We don't really know. In Fallujah, how did we do? Not as well as the Israelis. But so that bears lingering on for a second. But the second thing is that the reporting, as I've seen too many times now, the reporting is so ignorant because people repeat what Hamas has said within seconds.
Douglas decimates journalistic integrity, exposing their reliance on biased local sources shackled by Hamas. Why accept unverified figures like the inflated 30,000 casualties? These numbers, carelessly echoed by the world, recently slashed in half, shame reputable journalism. Israel's purported brutality results in fewer civilian casualties than the US military operations. Should audiences trust second-hand narratives? Clearly, we must demand skepticism towards sources controlled by propaganda machines.
Near the beginning of the conflict, there's a place called the Shifa. It's sometimes called the Shifa Hospital. It should be better known as the Shifa Hamas Command Headquarters. It's a place we know from video footage, CCTV. They took some of the hostages on the 7th, and they didn't take them to the Shifa Hospital to treat them. The Shifa had a rocket land in its car park some months ago. And Hamas immediately announced that it was an Israeli rocket that had hit the hospital and killed 500 people. Note, by the way, that the Israelis took months to work out the exact number of figures from the 7th of October who'd been killed in Israel, because it's extremely hard. I've been to the morgues. I've seen the bodies. I've seen the charred remains. It takes a long time to work out who's dead in a burned-out house. Mm-hmm. Magically, Hamas can do it like that and can come up with a round figure. Oh, but after the world has said that the Israelis fired a rocket at a hospital and killed 500 people, after some time, sure as anything, we discover the rocket was an Islamic Jihad rocket fired from inside Gaza, which landed in the car park of the Shifa compound and may have killed some people, not 500. This is the day in, day out reality of reporting on that conflict.
Murray's dissection ferociously dismantles deceit. Hamas's baseless claims, inflating Shifa hospital casualties to 500, crumble under scrutiny. The terrorists' lightning-fast casualty counts reek of fabrication, while Israel meticulously identifies its fallen. Then truth surfaces. A Palestinian rocket, not Israeli, caused the chaos, unveiling their ruthless disregard for Gazans. Why trust those who spin reality's threads into fiction? Blind belief in illusions risks real-world peace and justice.
Just before we're sitting here, the Israeli Defense Forces are in Rafah, operating in unbelievably complicated situations, very, very intense fighting, to get the last remaining hostages out and to find Sinwar, the architect of the 7th, who's almost certainly hiding in the tunnels under Rafah. Just before we're sitting here, there's an outrage around the world claiming that the Israelis have been indiscriminately bombing a tent encampment of Palestinians. Now, already, after that lie has gone around the world, we discover what happened was that just yesterday or the day before, Hamas fired rockets from between the tents in one of the civilian areas, and they fired them at Tel Aviv. Now the Israelis located the launch pads, and they fired. And it seems that what happened was that a munition of Hamas arms exploded as a secondary explosion. Now, whose fault is that? All of these deaths are, in my mind, very clearly the fault of Hamas. There is a cost to starting a war. And there is no law of war that I know of that says you're allowed to start a war and massacre civilians in their homes, and then, when you start to lose the war you started, say this is unfair. We would accept this under no other situation, in no other circumstances. But it's the Jews, so it's different.
Murray ruthlessly shreds the deceptive narratives surrounding the conflict. The IDF, tangled in intense combat, is rescuing hostages while fighting twisted propaganda. Do we blame Israelis for defending against rockets from civilian cover, or Hamas, whose strategies butcher innocent lives? These terrorists launch attacks from populated areas, crafting collateral tragedies. Their rockets, hidden among civilians, cause the devastation. Hamas initiated this bloodbath. Why the double standard for Israel?
From what you saw in Israel to American campuses, we had a congressional hearing with the president of Harvard, the president of Penn, the president of MIT, and all three of them refused to say in any simple, straightforward, forthright way, all moral codes prohibit advocating genocide. Exactly. All right, we have that. We have pro-Palestine from the river to the sea is the chant, demonstrations and encampments on one elite campus after another. What on earth is going on?
Let me do this in the briefest way I can. The people who are currently at encampments in support of Hamas, which is what it is, I've seen those things. I've heard what they say. They're for Hamas. Even I, with my often jaded glance at the disintegration of thought in the West, was slightly surprised at the speed with which adults on American campuses were able to rush straight into the arms of Hamas. But fine, there they are. I would put out this question. I suspect you'd agree with me, Peter, that the women in particular protesting there on these campuses probably a few years ago, were holding up signs that said, "Believe all women." Do you remember Believe All Women?
I remember that.
Wow, Believe All Women turns out to have a border. It turns out to have a cordon around it. It turns out to have an exception. It has a subclause. The subclause is, except Jewish women. Some of those students, 10 years ago maybe, when was it, 2014, the Chibok schoolgirls were stolen from northern Nigeria, where I've also been. And Hollywood celebrities, students, Michelle Obama, bring back our girls. Hashtag bring back our girls. Tell me where the demonstration has been, anywhere in America, from the campuses to Hollywood. Bring back our Jewish children. There's a reason there is no such hashtag. There's a reason why there is no such campaign. Jews don't count. Not in the eyes of these perverted minds on American campuses. Now, they don't know that they're bigots. And they may not know that they're racists, but we've been here before, many times. A lot of people don't mean to be evil. They don't mean to support evil, but they support evil. And that's what the students at Columbia and endless numbers of other universities across America have been doing.
Douglas comes blazing, condemning these hypocritical campus activists. How dare they claim compassion, yet align with extremists who butcher innocents, clutching at chance, supporting terror, blindfolded to their inconsistencies, chanting, "Believe all women," yet they're silent on Jewish women's suffering. Shame on these selective moralists. How can society tolerate such intellectual hypocrisy and selective empathy? This isn't activism, it has become bias, veiled anti-Semitism masquerading as social justice.
It looks to me, this is a very rough cut, I'm just telling you, I'm speaking now just as somebody who reads the newspapers and looks at the news. Presidents of universities and boards of trustees have figured out how to respond, or figured out at least that they must respond. So now encampments are being rolled up, or they're being very tightly limited. We have here's an example. We have at the University of Texas, there was some sort of protest. The president of the University of Texas let it go on very briefly. They were in violation of university rules. He called in the police and had it ended. With what result? That more than 700 members of the faculty of the University of Texas signed a statement protesting this brutal treatment of students. Dartmouth College, where there's a new president, I follow that situation closely because I went to Dartmouth. The new president gets a protest on the Green in Hanover. The protesters are in violation of college rules. The president has the police come in and take the protesters away. The president receives a vote of censure from the faculty of Dartmouth College, the first time any president in the more than 2-century history of Dartmouth College has ever been censured. So what I'm saying is it feels as though the kids will get sorted out sooner or later by reality, the job market, their parents. Presidents and boards understand the need to respond. But you've got embedded faculties, large proportions of whom are well, of course, and because of tenure, they're just there to stay. But what I don't understand is, what is the intellectual transmission belt here? How do you go from the senior members of faculties on the great universities today are people who trained in the 60s. How do you go from anti-Vietnam War to pro-Hamas? What is the intellectual progression that gets you from there to there?
I mean, there's an intellectual explanation. There's just also an obvious moral one. The intellectual one is that a lot of these people think their job is to educate students into becoming radicals.
I see. All right.
Now, a lot of I would like clearing out of American academia to such an extent that the job market would be unavailable to them in future. A lot of these people have nothing to add. They've never had anything to add. They teach grievance studies. And I always hoped, like a lot of people of my inclination, that these people would discover, the graduates would discover that there were no jobs for them after learning how to be bitter and stupid at the cost of about $60,000 a year. But the faculty encourage them with the idea that, first of all, their opinions matter, and secondly, that they're informed.
Murray's stance obliterates the coddling of radical students. These faculty enablers are poisoning young minds, breeding a generation of entitled whiners. Isn't it time we purged academia of this toxic ideology? Most humanities professors lean far left, indoctrinating students with anti-Western propaganda. We must ruthlessly excise this cancer from our educational institutions before it metastasizes further, destroying the very foundations of our society.
I will say this as strongly as I can. These students are narcissists of the worst kind, because they're not just narcissists, but they're ignoramus narcissists. Who thinks that the Israeli war cabinet, after a massacre of its people, should alter its war policy because of a bunch of ignoramuses in Colombia who've never seen a war and never lost someone in a war? Why would any government alter its war plan and get its generals to stop its war to get its hostages back because of some students at Berkeley? It's preposterous. What do they think they're doing? Who do they think is listening to them? Why do they think they're important? Do they know how to clear house to house in Rafah? Do they have any idea how to get the remaining hostages back without any civilian casualties? Are they able to clear large areas of ground with a tunnel network wider than the London Underground? Do they know how to find tunnel shafts? Do they know how to discern the difference between a tunnel shaft which is booby-trapped and one which is not? None of these things. They've thought of none of them. So that's the narcissism thing and the ignorance thing, but the evil thing is that instead of being some banal peacenik saying something like, why can't they just have peace?
Right.
Say, brilliant insight, brilliant, no Israeli ever thought of that. Instead of that, they actually run all the way to supporting evil. But we've seen this before, Peter. We saw this in the 60s. We saw it in the 70s. There were previous generations of people in Germany, across Europe, and in America, who had one idea of what not to be. Don't be a Nazi.
Yes.
Right. That was their one political philosophy after 1945. And it's not a bad place to start. Not a bad place to start. Don't be a Nazi. These people even now call themselves quite often anti-Nazis, anti-fascists. Well, in the 70s and the 60s, a lot of the people who orientated themselves that way, and that way alone, found themselves, for instance, supporting the PLO, the PLA, the PFLP, even when they were hijacking planes. And some of the people, very interesting book about this by Paul Berman, some of the people involved in that, whose one orientation had been, don't let's be Nazis, let's do what our parents did in Germany, ended up separating Jews from non-Jews on hijacked planes. So when these students today at American campuses who believe they're anti-fascist, they believe they're anti-racist, this is their one idea, and they behave as if it's an extraordinary idea and available only to them. When they decide that in order to be anti-Nazi and anti-oppressor and anti-white colonialist and much more, end up supporting or covering for or trying to ignore the rape and massacre of Jews, they're the Nazis. They're the Nazis.
Murray ferociously dismantles the egotistical fantasy. Naive students, oblivious to real-world brutality, demand Israel change strategic war plans after massacres. These self-righteous, uninformed brats dare to lecture war-hardened Israelis. Do they fathom military nuances or hostage rescue complexities? Who are they to pontificate? Ignorance parades as virtue. They cloak evil under delusional righteousness. History echoes. Those self-proclaimed anti-fascists unwittingly embrace Nazism's despicable legacy. Today's anti-oppressors mirror yesterday's tyrants.
Europe, Ukraine. Again, I'm just going to give you a layman's reaction from from California. I'm as far away from Ukraine as can be. You were there. Very hard to see how to get Russia out of the roughly 1/6 to 1/5 of the country that Russia has taken.
Yeah.
And every day the war continues, even with American armaments,
Yeah.
more and more of Ukraine gets smashed. They're able to do a little bit of damage to Russians here and there. They send in a drone, they attack a ship. I think they've bottled up the Russian Black Sea Fleet, that's fine. But Russia continues to live more or less as it was before the war. Whereas Ukraine, city by city by city, the Russian population, I confess that I don't understand the Russian chain of command, how they can squander so many men.
It wouldn't be the first time in Russian history.
Well, that
that
is
the people
true.
in power haven't cared how many of their own
That
citizens
is true.
they killed.
That is true. But it looks
That's the Russian way of war.
right. So, but even at that, even at squandering, they still have that much larger a population. They can afford to get ground down at a faster rate than the Ukrainians because they can replace their numbers.
It's the same plan as Stalin had. Yeah.
All of that, grind down the Ukrainians, all of that. Shouldn't Ukraine simply cut the best deal it can right now? It worked out all right over time to be South Korea. You take the bit of the country that you can, you integrate entirely into the West, you establish free markets, you permit foreign investment, and 10, 20, 30 years later, you become a model to the world. Well, isn't some option like that available to Ukraine, and oughtn't they to take it?
I mean, it's not for me to advise them. I keep out of giving advice like that.
Well,
Because they've got, of course, more skin in the game than I do.
That's true, but now you're
Very
talking
easy
and this is, they have far more skin in the game than I do, but they rely on American aid, which is another question we can come to, which is why Europe hasn't stepped up more, but they rely on American aid. So America has some role to play here. All right, but what is your judgment? What is your, answer that
I
thought.
find it difficult. Well, let me say it, but I find it painful because I was with the Ukrainian army when they retook Mykolaiv and Kherson from the Russians.
The morale was soaring.
And the morale was soaring.
Yes, they surprised the world.
I really did think then, if they can keep pushing like this, they might get to Mariupol and so on. The spring offensive last year did not.
It just didn't work.
Didn't work. And there's a lot of soul-searching military responsibility and much more. I would think at this point, and I don't want to sort of betray my Ukrainian friends who, many of whom just say, it's not going to stop until we get everything back. Nevertheless, I pretty much agree with you that at some point there will have to be a negotiation because the counteroffensive has just not been successful enough. And at the moment, the Russian forces are still laying siege in a very, very brutal way to Kharkiv. And the energy seems to be on their side.
Murray's brutal critique slashes conventional thought. Russia's relentless aggression grinds Ukraine mercilessly, yet Ukraine's resilience shines fiercely. Historical echoes of Stalin's cold indifference chill us, while Ukraine's determination resonates courageously. Unfathomable sacrifices persist. Where's Europe's aid? Ignoring American support concerns, should Ukraine cede for future prosperity akin to South Korea? Global exemplar. Is capitulating now permissible when resilience may yield unforeseen triumph?
The point you make, I would agree with, but there's a proviso, which is the thing that the Ukrainians understand better than either of us, which is it's not clear that any settlement that was made and any new carve-up that was agreed to would be agreed to for very long.
Right.
Because we don't know with 100% certainty how much land Vladimir Putin wants to take. He has said he wants all of Ukraine. And he's made an awful lot of running to try to get it. Killed a lot of young and old Ukrainians, a lot of young Russians. But we don't really know, in my view, with enough certainty, how hungry he is for the rest of the region. I've been to Moldova The Moldovans seem to be very agitated. I was in the Baltic states last year. They're very worried. Now, my impression is, probably like yours, surely Vladimir Putin wouldn't break into NATO countries. I don't know. I was in Georgia some years ago, and of course, he was happy to invade Georgia in 2008. So when people say things like, well, this is, there are some people, particularly on the right in America, who say things like, well, he doesn't do this sort of thing. I've seen him do it before.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, he does do this kind of thing. But the question of, would West and East Ukraine remain like, I don't know, West and East Germany or North and South Korea? Or would he settle there and then move on and then move on?
He wouldn't move on if there were an American guarantee, or if the Europeans pulled themselves together and provided a guarantee. If Germany showed, I'm putting this in the form of a question, I'm saying something that you may find completely outrageous, so respond.
I'll say.
Yes, of course. Shy.
You can rely on me.
Yes, exactly, exactly. But if the Germans pulled themselves together to demonstrate half the seriousness that the Poles have demonstrated, half the seriousness, small country, half the seriousness that the Estonians have demonstrated, that the Finns have demonstrated,
the Swedes.
that the Swedes of all people,
that
the Swedes have demonstrated, then if Europe stood up for Ukraine and said, that's it, Vladimir, that's it, he would have no choice, or at least we'd have. Okay, so the question then is, why hasn't this happened? Olaf Scholz, Putin invades Ukraine. Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor of Germany, gives remarkable speeches that shock all of us thrill all of us in the United States. We're going to get serious. There's an emergency addition to the defense budget. We're going to increase it. And of course, nothing happens.
Murray's assessment is devastatingly accurate. Putin's voracious appetite for conquest is undeniable. Georgia, Crimea, now Ukraine, the pattern is clear. How can anyone ignore his blood-soaked history? Ukraine's devastating struggles reveal a tyrant eager for more. Like a voracious beast, he eyes Moldova and the Baltic states next. The West's spineless response is nauseating. Passivity reigns despite promises. The stakes, perilously real.
Some years ago, I was at a conference in Berlin. It was a sort of trilateral. I think it's long enough in the past that I can tell this story.
All right.
It was an off-record.
Your secret is safe with me.
Exactly. It was an off-record thing, but there was a German minister who gave a rather encouraging speech in which he said, and of course none of this sort of rhetoric without a certain amount of chill in our spine, but nevertheless, he said, Europe and indeed Germany will have to at some point realize, we have enemies, and we have to at some point be able to get to the stage where we not only are willing to die for our way of life, but to kill for it. And I went up to this minister afterwards and I said, I wondered if, don't mind, I could quote you on that, without attribution, obviously, but I said, if I could just, he said, absolutely not, absolutely not. Terror in his eyes. And I said, let me get this right. There are values you're willing to kill for, to die for, but only off the record? Look, a Ukrainian told me when I was there that they use the same number of bullets every day as France makes in a year. There is a global problem, a Western problem of arms supplies. This is the case for Israel, it's the case for Ukraine. They fire, in both conflicts, they are firing with extreme precision and care. Not just because they, certainly in the case of Israel, they particularly want to minimize civilian casualties, but because they don't have that much kit. So the reason I mention this is because every country, apart from America, but even America, look at Russia. Russia is on war footing like it was in the 40s. Yes. It has turned around its economy onto a wartime economy footing, which means it can do what it wants for as long as it wants. America, to be an ally of America today is not that easy a thing. And the Europeans, I'm afraid that we in Europe are, to an extent, like the kids in Berkeley. We can no longer fathom the idea of war. We can't believe it.
Douglas fearlessly exposes Europe's complacency. Where's the outrage? Why are they paralyzed by appeasement while enemies lurk? Germany's secret whispers of defense readiness are whispered, not shouted. Ukraine spews more bullets daily than France manufactures yearly, an alarming fact. Russia's militarization, unseen since the 1940s, mocks our stagnant peace dreams. Aren't alliances worth defending, fighting, risking all? Europe's ignorance of threats invites inevitable disaster.
Again, here's your American cousin. This is the way it looks to me. Europe has two problems. One of them is Vladimir Putin. Poles, good look, the Poles, the Baltics. Amazingly enough, the Swedes. But Germany can't move without, I beg your pardon, Europe can't move without Germany and France and all right. So that's one problem. But the second problem is the one you wrote about in The Strange Death of Europe, which has not abated. Europe is depopulating very rapidly. Every country in Europe, every single nation in Europe is well below replacement birth rate.
And at the same time, the Muslim population rises and rises, and illegal migration rises and rises, and the society changes all the time.
Correct. The statistic I read the other day that just shocked me is that by 2050, the population of Africa, hard to know how much of this is a Muslim population, but probably 60% of the gain, is projected to rise by 1 billion people. There are going to be many empty villages in Italy and France that look very attractive to poor people from sub-Saharan, well, from anywhere in Africa. Are there not? This is predictable. It's in the press. Vladimir Putin is there. We have to make some decisions about how to protect our culture. Is it worth protecting? How do we handle immigrants? What are the correct... And I just don't see...
None of them are serious. None of them are serious.
So here I had to me a shocking conversation with I will then shut up because this is for you to speak and not me. But this one just startled me. And I'm wondering if it was a representative conversation. I had a conversation with an Irish friend, and I said, well, I put all this to him, what about immigration? And the reply was, well, Al-Andalus wasn't so bad. In the Muslim kingdom of Granada, when they ruled the southern third of Spain, the Christians lived in peace, the Jews were permitted to live there, and the Muslims ran a rather tolerant society, and maybe that option will be open to us.
Maybe.
Has elite European opinion already in effect surrendered to its own... All right, so what's going on? What is going on?
Well, you can tell your Irish friend the following message from me. If he doesn't mind it so far, tell him to focus on some of the negatives. Let me give one negative. The Muslim migrant to Ireland who last year tortured and beheaded 3 gay men in Ireland. Ireland has often...
In the Republic?
In the Republic. Ireland has had a fair share of violence in its time. If it wants to import more, it should tell the public that's the aim. And your friend might say, well, on the one hand, you get a bit of Al-Andalus. I mean, good luck with that dream. And by the way, it wasn't a good dream anyway. Al-Andalus was not great for Christians and Jews. We were second-class citizens.
Yes.
Douglas masterfully dissects Europe's complacency. Europe's future is in jeopardy, with birth rates plummeting while migration surges. Can we ignore this seismic change any longer? The barbaric beheading of 3 gay men in Ireland by a Muslim migrant is just the tip of the iceberg. Why embrace a faded Al-Andalus fantasy? Italy's empty villages entice migrants. Isn't it time for serious immigration reform to preserve Europe's cultural sanctity?
But okay, if you're happy to live as a second-class citizen in your own country, do just explain to the public that every now and then one of them will be beheaded. Okay, Deal. Is he going to be happy with that? Maybe. If he is happy with it, he should say it. He should stand up and be a man and say it. He should say, oh, we get such great things from diversity. We get more beheading than we used to have in Ireland, but, you know, swings and roundabouts, chaps.
Murray delivers a scathing ultimatum. Either accept second-class status and occasional savage violence, or stand firm. Is more beheading the price of diversity Europe is willing to pay? Are you willing to sacrifice safety for diversity?
Britain. I'm treating Britain separately from Europe, which should please you in the first place, because after Brexit, it is at least formally separate from Europe. 14 years of a Tory government. There's going to be an election this summer. The present Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who is the, how many? David Cameron, the fifth Tory and fifth Tory Prime Minister in these 14 years, has called an election. I put it to you, my Tory friend.
Careful. Smallsy conservative. Do not stick me with the grotesque thing that is the Tory party.
Oh, is it that? That the Tories won 2 historic victories. They got Brexit through, and then they went to the country and returned with a majority of, what was it, 88 seats?
80, yeah.
80 seats.
Boris Johnson managed in 2019, yeah.
And and they had not the slightest idea what to do with either one. And after 14 years, even every Tory I know, it can't be every Tory full stop, but every Tory I know is sick of the Tory government and willing to take a chance on Labour, which is, whatever else it is going to be cooler toward free enterprise. We can't expect great leaps and bounds in the British economy. We can't expect Britain to ascend to new heights in its role in the world. The United Kingdom is about to go into a deep freeze.
Well,
is this fair?
Yes, it's generous. The Labour Party is led by Keir Starmer, a man whose idea of leadership is to say he's a leader. His deputy Angela Rayner.
Remind me never to cross you.
His deputy Angela Rayner is a person of zero distinction. His shadow cabinet includes people like David Lammy, the shadow foreign secretary at the moment, might be foreign secretary. Some years ago on a quiz show, David Lammy was asked I think I've got this right, which monarch. He was asked which monarch succeeded Henry IV, and he said Henry III. So he has a problem even understanding which direction history goes in. And in an interview on the radio last year, he said that he understood that it was possible for a man to become a woman because a man could, with the right medical help, grow a cervix. So we are not dealing with the brains of Britain here. And in fact, there's nobody of distinction that I can see in the shadow cabinet that's about to become the cabinet. Every country in Europe, and maybe America, is moving to the right, and particularly in Europe, inevitable with the immigration. The one exception is Britain. And the one exception is Britain because for 14 years, the Conservative Party has made a great Horlicks of government. The contempt, the loathing that many people who ought to have the Conservatives, who ought to be supporting the Conservatives, actually have for the Conservatives, is not possible to exaggerate. They wasted their time. I said in an article in The Spectator recently that
Douglas critiques Britain's potential fall into Labour's hands, driven by poor political leadership. In Britain, a shadow cabinet emerges, lacking significant intellect. David Lammy's blunders typify mediocrity, Starmer's empty leadership, Rayner's mediocrity, Lammy's ignorance, a disaster recipe. Tories stumbled, yet Labour's ineptitude is shocking. Countries lean right, but Britain defies logic, clinging left. With Tory failures, should Britain embrace a delusional party for economic revival?
Boris Johnson reminded me of Dr. Faustus in Christopher Marlowe's version. Because Dr. Faustus, if you remember, after selling his soul to Mephistopheles, wastes his time. He pinches the nose of the Pope and plays practical jokes on japes. And then your time is up and you go.
He sells his soul to the devil for nothing.
For nothing.
For nothing.
Why did Rishi Sunak climb the greasy pole of politics, stab Boris Johnson, just as Boris Johnson has stabbed other people, and Theresa May had stabbed people, and Liz Truss had stabbed people, and David Cameron and everyone else? Why did Rishi Sunak climb through politics, become prime minister, in order, as far as I can see, his flagship policy is to ban vaping? I like to think that a country could have more ambition than that.
All right.
Murray savagely lashes at political backstabbers, likening Boris to Faustus wasting his infernal trade. Rishi, a gleaming example of palace intrigue, assaults ambitions with meagre policies like vape bans. Britain, the empire of Colossus, now reduced. Are these the champions of a once indomitable realm? His argument stands fortified with statistics: 14.7% poverty under Tory rule, and almost 50% of Britons now distrust the government.
Douglas, the United States of America. It was a dozen or 15 years ago that Mark Stein wrote a book entitled America Alone. And I confess, although the book was brilliantly written and quite tightly argued, I thought, and Mark, we did an interview on the show about the book, and but I thought, oh, this is a little bit, you're being a provocateur here. But that's what it comes down to. You tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Well,
but we have China, we have Putin, we have who knows where this is going to go in the Middle East. The ultimate problem is not in Rafah. The ultimate problem is in Tehran.
yes.
Europe is in disarray. Not all of Europe, and not probably permanently. You just said yourself the electoral situation has to change. The continent is moving to the right.
Geert Wilders is the most popular politician in the Netherlands.
All right, there you have it. The polls are we've already been through this. The polls, there are impressive governments, but Germany, France, Spain, all right. So what do we make of the present state of American politics?
Well, I think a lot of what you've just described in the world is, I'm sorry to say this, but is the absence of American leadership. Not a total absence, it has to be said. I'm not the greatest fan of Joe Biden, but Joe Biden has armed his allies and has occasionally made strong noises on the world stage. However, I think it's without doubt that neither Vladimir Putin nor the mullahs in Tehran fear Joe Biden. Not really. Before Joe Biden came to office, Donald Trump had almost completely bankrupted the Iranians. And Joe Biden has brought them back in. They've been flushed with cash, sometimes literally with the cash. And that's why they can afford to play with their proxies like Hamas, and things like the 7th of October can happen. Funded, armed, trained by Iran. Why has southern Lebanon got 150,000 Iranian rockets pointed at Israel? Because after the 2006 conflict, which I was there for then as well, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1701, which said that the area in the south of Lebanon that Hezbollah were in, they must retreat from and take their rockets with them. And for the whole 18 years since, the rockets have just come back. They've just built up the rocket supply, and it's deadly. I've seen many of these rockets being shot over Israel in recent months. I've been up to the northern border a lot. There's a lot of activity. And it's a powder keg. As one Israeli said to me, Israel and Hezbollah are on a tandem bicycle going downhill, and the question isn't whether we crash, but when. Now, this would not have happened if America, in particular, had put its foot down with Iran. And
are you telling me that what we Americans are raised with, what we used to be raised with, what my generation was raised with, which is that the world needs a strong America? You're telling me it's true.
Douglas Murray's critique unflinchingly exposes America's diminishing global dominance. Once solid, strategic American leadership has now languished, allowing despots like Putin and Tehran's mullahs to confidently flex their muscles without fear. Under Trump's policies, financial strain nearly crippled Iran. Biden's leniency reversed this, bolstering Iranian proxies like Hamas. Is this the America we want? A paper tiger, toothless and trembling?
It's true. It's lethal without. And I mean, even the isolationist Republicans in America, I have great criticisms of.
Yes.
But it does interest me that they both want nothing to do with the world and yet to be the dominant power in the world. Even the sort of Republican...
That is the position I'd like myself. I don't think it's available.
It's not available. No. It's not available. You can't do it. Other people step in.
Okay.
Look at the fact that in the last 4 years, Russia, Iran, and China have stepped in everywhere. And I'm not just talking militarily. Look at the way that Africa is being brought up. Look at the way in which mineral resources are brought up across Africa. Are the Americans on top of that? Are the Europeans anything like the Chinese are? No. We're not on top of any of this. And this goes back to a central thing, which is, do the students on American campuses realize that whilst they are being expensively educated into idiocy and uselessness, for each of them, there's a dozen students in China working their socks off to get a lifestyle that these kids in America seem to think is their birthright. It ain't their birthright. It's not inevitable. They only have these rights because better men than them fought for them. And if this generation of Americans want to sit out the world, they can ask the people of Israel what happens, what it's like when reality comes and hits you as hard as anything.
Douglas obliterates any illusion. A strong America is vital. Without it, chaos reigns. Western naivety cowers as Russia, China, and Iran surge across the globe. Are entitled American students blind? As Chinese peers grind tirelessly, others wrest control. Minerals in Africa slip away. Rights aren't innate, they're earned. Ignore this and face reality's wrath. We can't be idle spectators on this cutthroat world stage.
About the United States. But give me a moment to set it up. We, the United States, used to have armed forces. It used to be American military doctrine that we ought to be able to fight in two major theaters at once. Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, recognized that we just didn't have the forces to do that anymore. So it's now doctrine, one major theater, one minor theater. That's where we are now. Theater 1, Ukraine and the North Atlantic. Theater 2, Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Theater 3, China, Taiwan, and the Pacific. All of this could go bad very fast. That's item 1. Here's item 2. I'm going to try to be non-partisan here, but correct me if I move in one. We have, oddly enough, two incumbents in some strange way running. President Biden, in his 80s, let's put it as charitably as possible, he's not quite as quick off the mark as he was some years ago.
Yeah. It's sad.
Your word. And then we have Donald Trump, who's been indicted in one jurisdiction after another, who is himself 77 years old, and who seems erratic, unpredictable. All right. But these seem to be the, well, if you want to toss in Robert Kennedy Jr. So there is this strange, I feel, there's a kind of free-floating anxiety in the United States. This is a really dangerous moment.
Yeah.
And these are the choices. Well, wait, let's withdraw from the world and just get rich. There are all kinds of strange, let's find some third party So what would your word be as we enter the presidential, this is springtime, it'll be summer, the election is in the autumn. What advice would you give to American voters? How should they weigh the reality as you see it and make their decision?
The host's probing inquiry ignites a firestorm. America's military might, once unrivaled, now teeters on the brink. 3 global hotspots threaten to erupt simultaneously. Yet our forces are stretched thin. Leaders, we've a sluggish Biden and an erratic, indicted Trump. Is this truly the best America can offer in these perilous times? Voters, awakened by this urgency, must navigate this complex landscape.
I don't like advising people in countries I don't have a vote in. about how to vote.
Well, there are some of us who hope that's only a matter of time before you apply for your citizenship. But go ahead. I take the point. But, go ahead.
But there's one thing I just mentioned beforehand. That you're completely right about these. The idea that there could be 3 theaters of operation in the coming years, that is when American dominance is completely tested, and America has to decide whether or not it's serious. And there are a lot of people in America who are not serious, left and right, Republicans and Democrats. But there's one other thing that has to be said about that, which is a lot of the energy on the right now is taken up by people saying, why can't we even secure the southern border? And why don't we do that before looking after other countries' borders? And I actually think, although it's a cheap rhetorical trick, nevertheless, there's something in it.
There's something in it.
And I sometimes refute them by saying, well, do you honestly think that if America weren't supporting our allies in Ukraine and Israel, the money would be going to the southern border? I think not. It's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of will. But that thing of the southern border, by the way, is the extension of what I wrote about in The Strange Death of Europe, which is, of course, not just about Europe, but also about the whole of the developed world, which is that the great challenge of this century will be precisely what you referred to earlier, which is billions of people who do not have our lifestyle. They do not have our advantages. They come from countries which are very badly run, horribly run, corrupt, impoverished, violent, and much more. Not all of them, but that's pretty much the norm in the developing world. And they would like to live in our countries. Can we say no? Now, Europeans are not very good at saying no. In the last 14 years, the Conservative Party came to power in 2010 with a promise from David Cameron that he would bring the hundreds of thousands of migrants a year net coming into the UK down to the tens of thousands, which shouldn't be impossible. It was where we were in the 1990s.
And you are an island, after all.
We're an island. It's not as if we don't have some natural advantages.
Yes.
The immigration figures for last year, in the last year of a Tory government, were almost 1 million net.
14 years later.
14 years later. They were off by scales. And, you know, it's the same in America. And people don't, a lot of people outside America don't understand this, but I understand it inside America, as I know you do, and I think a lot of Americans do. The people coming across the southern border, flooding across the southern border, millions of people coming to America illegally, is responded to with the same inevitability as Europe has done. And it'll lead to the same things. It's completely divorced from reality. It's so...
Douglas unapologetically annihilates American complacency, revealing the real battle isn't just foreign borders, but America's forgotten frontier, its own southern border. Why pretend that neglecting domestic security in favor of distant allies doesn't showcase an outrageous lack of resolve? Consider European immigration chaos, an imploding lesson on weak policies yielding harrowing consequences. Shouldn't America awaken from its slumber to prioritize its future over this lethargy?
It's not just weak, what the politicians are letting happen to our societies. It's positively treacherous, because what they're doing is setting up an ever more unstable society for their successors. And some of the Democrats have said to me, well, you know, the people coming from Central and South America are very like us. They're Christians. You want to see the footage of who's coming across the southern border now? I was watching the other day, and I was going through one of the photos. I said, everybody here seems to be a sub-Saharan African. Well, the whole world is what... It's cheaper to get into America from sub-Saharan Africa today illegally than it is to get illegally into Europe. If you take a flight to Mexico from Africa, that's maybe $1,000. Maybe you spend $5,000 to a cartel to get you over the southern border. That's a bargain. And you're in America, and America seems to be weaker than Europe even now on the illegal
can be
migration.
there in days.
So it's cheaper. It might be 10,000 to go to Europe. So is America to steal Chris Caldwell's title? Is America going to be the same with different people in it? You will just hope yes. And the problem about that, it's like the old fallacy of the turkey. You know, the turkey is had a good life and enjoys itself in the field, wanders around one day after the next. Seems charming. People come and feed the turkey, and the turkey has a good life. And then one day it's Thanksgiving.
Yes. Right.
And so when people say to me, and I've got to hear these incredibly self-satisfied people all the time, when they say things like, it's inevitable, or it's just going to be the same as what it was, Douglas. What you're saying is alarmist, like what Mark Stein has said was alarmist. It's just all going to be the same.
Douglas obliterates the blind trust in unchecked immigration policies, crushing naivete with stark facts. Current US policies, recklessly welcoming economic migrants, morph society into a powder keg, ready to explode. In 2023, illegal crossings at the US-Mexico border reached record highs, with over 2.4 million encounters recorded by the US CBP. Is this a nation maintaining its identity or surrendering it?
One day, it's Thanksgiving.
All right. Last question. The last time we recorded a program, just the two of us, we were talking about the strange death of Europe, and I closed with a question. And I'm going to repeat the same question, because here we are, some years later. Things have changed, generally for the worse. But let me ask you the same question. In 2024, given the state of the world, we haven't even talked about the disruptions of artificial intelligence that are going to be barreling at us. How does one lead a good life?
I think I answered that before in this very room by saying by leading what was regarded as being a good life until yesterday. And I would repeat that. I'd add something to it. I've changed a bit in the last 6 months, and some of my viewers and readers have noticed it. And I've changed because of what I've seen in Israel and the response, and specifically the response of young Israelis who have, you know, there was a sort of view among older Israelis that the young generation was a bit weaker.
Soft.
A bit soft, right? You know, the years of peace had done what years of peace always do. And, you know, they want to just party in Tel Aviv, they want to go out to the clubs, they want to be on Instagram and TikTok and that sort of thing. And, you know, when the moment of test and trial came for their generation, as it did on the 7th, they stepped up. They'd be magnificent. Magnificent. I've seen them up close, I've seen them in the field, I see people who've just lost, you know, their comrades, and they go straight from the battlefield to a funeral and straight back to the battlefield. These are remarkable young men and women. Now, they understand something which is very important. And I said this a few weeks ago at a speech in the Manhattan Institute. But life isn't just given to you. Life is something you have to fight for. You have to fight for the right to be at the club in Tel Aviv, or somebody else has to fight for you. If you want to live a good life, either you fight for it, or you expect somebody else to.
Douglas praises Israel's resilient youth, showing that a principled life thrives on bravery, not comfort. When peace faded, conflict shattered illusions. Young Israelis embody valor, confronting adversity and shattering global complacency. Society's fragility is evident. Life isn't handed to you. It's earned by facing harsh realities. Israel's youth, forged in fire, embody the raw power of purpose in a primal survival battle.
I believe very strongly today that people in America, Europe, Britain, the rest of the West, are going to have to get serious very fast, because something is going to happen. I don't know what, But something is going to happen in my lifetime that is going to bring the kind of reality that the people of Israel saw on the 7th to the people of America, to the people of Europe, to the people of Britain. And we should prepare for that, and we should prepare a generation for that. And we should encourage them. They've got to break out of the thing they're in, these ignoramuses, the narcissists, the navel gazers. We've got to tell them that the age of grievance is over. The age of grievance will be over with an age of heroism and courage. And we should encourage that from everybody. And if these other people who want to hold us all back and want to make us talk about things that are so banal and boring, like gender woo-woo and I'm feeling non-binary, no, don't have time for you. Get out the way. Life's too serious. Get ready.
Douglas Murray, thank you.
Murray's premonition is chillingly prophetic. Statistics show terrorism's global rise, with a 22% increase in attacks since 2017. We must obliterate this culture of victimhood and cultivate resilience. Cast away the childish grievances. Reality demands action, resolve, and bravery. Our survival depends on embracing heroism, not wallowing in trivial identity politics. Wake up to the impending trials ahead. Do we dare ignore the storm approaching? From dissecting the October 7th atrocities to challenging Western complacency, Murray has ignited a crucial debate. What's your take on his uncompromising stance on Hamas, immigration, and the preservation of Western values? Should we accept the brutal reality of our world and focus on obliterating our enemies instead of fantasizing world peace? Too harsh or a necessary wake-up call? Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Let's keep this vital conversation going and confront these pressing issues head-on.